Welcome, everyone. I am so excited about this conversation, not because I was at Davos, as I've been informed is the correct pronunciation. I may not always do that, but because we saved our carbon footprint and stayed at home, and our very dear friend Marisa went to Davos and is going to report to us about how things were. So I'm really excited about this conversation. If you are dialing in from, well, not if, wherever you're dialing in from, it'd be great to know where you're dialing in from. It would also be great to know if you were there, if you followed the news while it was happening, and what you're interested in about Davos. I said it wrong, sorry. My apologies to the locals. So my name is Rita Soni. I am Principal Analyst for Impact Sourcing and Sustainability Research at Everest Group. And I am really pleased to be moderating this conversation with my very dear colleague, Arpita, and my very dear friend, Marisa, who is a fellow New Yorker. And as I said, traveled to Davos for The Digital Economist and has an amazing background. And Marisa, I'd love for you to just give a quick introduction of yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rita. So I am an AI ethicist, primarily an educational psychologist, and I'm a researcher. And I serve with Digital Economist as the Applied AI Working Group lead. And we're a think and do tank, a global organization, not unlike Everest, really working on serving positive human and planetary outcomes. I also serve with IEEE, which is the largest engineering organization in the world, on recommended standards for AI. And I'm co-chair of AI Ethics Education Committee there, as well as chair of global methodologies for our technology. There's a technology and climate repair initiative, Planet Positive 2030. And I'm a contributor to other global organizations like UNESCO and UNEP focused on responsible AI. So, underlying both in climate and in AI, it's really about how are we doing this responsibly for both humans and the planet. So it can't be just humans, it's got to be the whole system.
And you basically don't sleep, I think. Those are a lot of hats, which is amazing, which is also why I love having these conversations with you. So to get us started in this, Arpita, it would be great if you can set the context. Why is Everest Group talking about Davos? What are technology and technology service providers interested in when it comes to those kind of sustainability conversations? What's their role in these international gatherings and the multilateral and multi-stakeholder initiatives?
Sure, Rita. And first of all, I would like to thank Marisa for joining us in this conversation. I'm sure we have a lot of interesting stuff coming up. But before we get into the meat of the conversation, I would just like to introduce everyone to Everest Group Sustainability Technology and Services Research. So within Everest Group, we try to take a holistic approach towards sustainability and not I won't be sticking to any specific jargon. I think Marisa will cover this later, why sustainability, ESG, and all the jargons are probably more of a hindrance than helping anybody in anything. So when it comes to sustainability, we take the triple bottom line approach of people, planet, as well as profit. We try to understand how technology service providers specifically are helping their clients use the power of technology to transform their organizations into building more purpose-driven organizations. And purpose-driven organizations are not just about environment, it's not just about people, it's about a holistic approach that can sustain the resources for the future generations as well, while meeting the needs of the current generation. And I would request the host to move to the next slide. So just to get to the L2 level insights into what are the typical services that we see IT service providers helping the clients with. So when it comes to environment related services, we cover aspects such as decarbonization, sustainable experiences, resource management, circular economy, another very important topic. And in a complementary abstract, we have also attached a study that we have recently done, where these services are not just helping reduce your carbon footprint, it's also about building a business case for sustainability to attract the right consumers, to attract the right stakeholders, investors, and get benefit out of it. When it comes to people focus services, we're covering aspects such as health and safety, DEIB, another very important topic that we will be focusing on in the rest of this conversation, especially with the conversation around AI ethics, sustainable experiences, community impact that technology can drive for organizations. And last but not the least is the profit element of sustainability, which is how service providers are helping organizations build a business case for sustainability to get those upfront investments running, to see the long term return on investment for these sustainability initiatives. So that's a little brief around how at Everest Group we are covering sustainability. And when it comes to Davos, and my apologies for the pronunciation again, but I was expecting that this particular year, with themes such as risks and opportunities of AI, geopolitics, political divides, and macroeconomics, so top of mind for everyone. And having just had so much energy devoted to climate and the environment just 4 weeks earlier at the COP28, I was expecting that Davos attention was expected to be a bit shifted to these topics rather than climate or sustainability, which which was what I think true to some extent. But despite so many geopolitical crises on the table, climate change did get some attention on the agenda, with a growing understanding of the interconnectivity to other global challenges, the almost universal realization of the urgency of the organizations, and especially the leadership to come together to drive long-term strategy for climate, nature, and energy was highly evident in whatever discussions that happened. Considering that 5 years ago, climate change and nature-related discussions represent a much smaller fraction compared to what it's today. But the question still remains: are we moving quickly, and are we thinking big enough? I think that brings me to Marisa to add more color, uh, being present at the event. How was her experience? What are the conversations you were a part of? What was interesting and what was not as per your expectations?
Wonderful. Yeah, so I think the things that really stood out to me, I went to, in for those who have been, you understand the kind of the ecosystem of it. For those who have not, there is what happens inside of the World Economic Forum, and then there are what they call the side events. And many of the conversations that are happening are very vitally important are in these side events, and they're held by multiple organizations. Multiple countries have houses, right? They have these spaces where people are coming together, and we're bringing people from different organizations to speak. And that's where we really begin to see a cross section. I mean, yes, of course, what happens inside the forum is important, and yet these side events are really talking about very often with people who are closer to the ground of who's really dealing with situations. So the first thing, Arpita, it was, as you mentioned, is collaboration, and that was a theme first and foremost in every event that I went to. It didn't matter whether it was a technology event. I mean, many of the events I went to, and certainly ones I spoke at, were ones on AI and technology, and there was an AI fever. I'm just going to say there was AI fever that everyone kind of jokes about, but also was very real. There was not a single discussion that happened that it did not involve AI. And yes, we would love as we're going, please, any questions you have, things that were important to you, please let us know, because those are the kinds of things that also in real time we can begin to also address. So a couple of the things there with collaboration. This was collaboration certainly in every context, both on the macro level and also on a micro level, when we're beginning to talk not just about collaborations between systems, right, and between organizations and between governments, but we're also talking about the within organizations, with it, right? So that this is really talking about different forms of partnership and collaborations that are really needed. They're new, right? There was a call quite last year. There was a call for, and it's something that I specialize in, which is transdisciplinary collaboration. And there was not as much mention about it this year, but there was talk about it last year. And I think this is really what we're beginning to call for. We're beginning to call for transdisciplinary, which is different than our traditional multi or inter. It's really bringing in new people. It's bringing in new ways of collaborating and knowing, because we're facing problems that are new. They're novel, and we can't solve them in the old ways. So one of the things that the main focuses of the event was rebuilding trust. I mean, that was kind of the overarching theme. And I think that was why so much of the conversation happened around collaboration. But if you're rebuilding trust, to me, more importantly, it was about where are we establishing trust? Because where trust is in different places. So who's rebuilding and how, we're not quite so sure, but establishing trust. And I think that's really a question for everyone, regardless of what industry we're in, what area we're in, is how are we establishing? Because maybe trust wasn't there to start with. And what does trust means? Because the second big theme was uncertainty. And it is an uncertain time. And and I'll talk about that later. There's a lot of repercussions from that during this time of uncertainty, of people looking for tangible solutions. Mm-hmm. And some of it will be tangible. Some things are tangible. And many of them are really emerging. These are emerging things, emerging problems that are being solved. And that will require a new kind of collaboration, because we're talking about something new. Another main topic being discussed was healthcare. And that was both the advancements and opportunities, as well as the concerns over, we know COVID was a huge issue that impacted everyone, but also there's been a gigantic mental health pandemic that we know, and that was being discussed, that was mentioned. Solutions for it, not so much. And people are looking for AI solutions, which also has some implications, but healthcare was a big on the agenda. Finance and the future of fintech. There was discussion about VC predictability, right? Because people are looking to see where they're going to make their investments. There was lots of course, conversation about blockchain, digital twins, NFTs for assets, so tokenization of assets. There was quite a bit of discussion around data and what data means, in both data safety, data sovereignty, and how data is being used, protected, translated. Data is gigantic. Is the conversation around data as oil, right? Data as the new oil. And I think and I will say the last one, which I expected to be much more in focus, was climate. And people, when it was spoken about, it was spoken about seriously, and people were talking about it. And yet there was there would seem to be kind of a dissonance between the actions being taken and the urgency being talked about. And that came in the form of things like the discussions about even arguing SDGs. Is it ESGs or SDGs? Is of people, to your point, Arpita, of understanding the full scope of sustainability and what that means, or climate repair, is it a regenerative? Are we working on regenerative ecosystems, not just generative, right? Because that stops, there's only a limit to that, but on regenerative ecosystems. And people, and that was not said in those words, and yet there was it seemed to be an interest in that.
That's really helpful, Marisa. And, I'll actually beg to differ on at least one of the opening points about all these new situations. I think many of the situations are known to us, and we have a lot of history around it. For instance, more than half of the world is going to be voting in elections this year, and we know disinformation has been a challenge related to that, which I believe was also discussed. So there's the unknown, and then there's also the things that we know and we've already experienced and need to address. So it's a really helpful overview in thinking about what was discussed. And I think what's particularly interesting too is this is the forum where the private sector really holds the stage, more so than the multilats and sort of the third sector, as we call it. So it seems surprising that there was still so much debate about terminologies and not necessarily the actions. But that said, I do understand that the tech themes were across the sections that went beyond AI. Even though I think the media on our side was like, it was only AI all the time, as you said. So yeah, Arpita, it'd be great to get your thoughts around the data security, the systems and digital twins, predictive technologies. I think quantum also came up. It sounds to me like the market is ready to move and invest in all of this as they talk about it in a forum like Davos. But the industry itself kind of began the year in a very cautious way, really saying, oh, sustainability, just tell me, what do I need to do to meet the regulators' needs?
Sure, Idam, and completely aligned with you there. So I feel before getting into that, I want to cover the role the technology is playing within sustainability. So technology, and when I say technology, it covers all the next generation Gaga technologies that came up a lot in Davos as well. Technology has a very centric role within sustainability. It can enable sustainability through these predictive technologies that you talked about, through digital twins, energy monitoring. You can build more efficient operations within your organization, and ultimately it can translate into carbon footprint emission coming down or your cost aspects coming down. While the other angle that organizations especially need to consider, and I think there are, on a positive note, there are conversations happening around it, is the technology itself sustainable? Now, in the first part, when we look at the market sentiment, I feel it used to be an intention issue, as you rightly mentioned, Rita, that okay, just help me do the bare minimum, let me get ahead of the regulations, and I'm good with that. But we are observing that there's this mindset shift happening, and the intention issue is being resolved. Now it's more about capability issue. And considering, as Marisa mentioned, data is such an integral factor, especially in mapping sustainability transition pathways, because there is so much interdependencies between the company's value chains and the local specificities of adaptation. So that the financial impact of climate risks on companies is affecting almost every stakeholder to some degree, and the complexities associated with bringing this data from upstream downstream together adds another layer of challenge for organizations. So that's where the capability aspect comes into picture. And especially considering another element is the foundation of trust is transparency, right? When it comes to technology, the role of data and technology underpins many of the trends we are watching in 2024. However, as reliance on newer technology grows, there is an increased pressure to ensure robust governance mechanisms are in place to manage the risks and opportunities that the technology provides. And especially in the recent years, with the rapid adoption of AI, associated risks such as data security concerns, privacy breaches are very common. To manage these risks, ensuring effective governance and ethical practices is becoming crucial. There are some hopes. I think there's a recent 2023 EU AI Act to provide risk-based, human-centered approach. I feel 2024 could bring several more regulations and guidelines globally. But I'm very curious to hear Marisha's view on this.
Well, yeah, thank you. And these are, these are very complex issues, as we know, which is also, as I had discussed with Rita before, another huge theme, and I'll come around to that later again, is education. And there's a kind of an enormous amount of education that needs to happen on each of the topics that you mentioned, Arpita, is the idea of what is data slavery, what are digital twins, how are we using these mechanisms, the idea that something is sustainable, and it may be that technology may be working on sustainability. It might be a methodology that is extraordinary. Simultaneously, there are wicked problems in innovation and technology. And one of those wicked problems having to do with, when I'm going to refer to climate repair, right, versus sustainability. When we're talking about climate repair, is many of the systems that we're using, and whether they're AI systems or technology, they might be not AI. There's also a confusion about what is technology and what is AI and what is Gen AI. And so there's a lot of education there that's needed. But the idea of when we do begin to get into quantum, when we do begin to get into much more in-depth and generative AI, we're also talking about there's a benefit risk there. There are carbon emissions, which most people are not aware of. And it was surprising to see how few people were aware of the carbon emissions created by large AI systems. Also, something that was not mentioned very often was the water consumption, right? So when we have large servers for Gen AI, gigantic servers, and we have instances of this. This is not just theoretical. Those systems require massive amounts of water for cooling. And it will eventually come back into the atmosphere, but it will not come back into the atmosphere fast enough. And I believe this is a problem that our new problem solvers can solve. I'm an optimist, so I'll stick with that. Simultaneously, it is important for us to understand, in the same way that companies believing they are going green by using only technology or only going digitally may not be, depending on how much of the energy they're using digitally. This is where these are really important discussions to be having about what does it mean, so that it isn't just a series of check boxes that we're having for sustainability, but it is something that is deeper. And I'm just going to add one thing, which is also, I'm going to push on only human-centered, because human-centered may not necessarily serve the planet, may not necessarily serve the living world, right? And so, yes, it does theoretically in its endpoint, but I really want to make sure that what we're really talking about is being in service to our entire ecosystem when we're referring to climate and responsibility.
That's super helpful, Marisa. I think I'm excited to start seeing some questions and comments. Scubaverse, that's hilarious.
Yes.
Eric.
Oh, hi, Eric. It's Eric Scubaverse. It's a fantastic program. Go ahead. Yes.
So I wanted to get us to talk about Wendy's question about digital accessibility. I think we did hear quite a bit about the sort of human side of technology, but I do think that the fact is that people with disabilities are often a secondary thought, and having digital accessibility embedded into solutions is really the way to do it, but not always necessarily the way that we're thinking about it. So, Wendy, I'm not sure if you're talking about people with disabilities or if you're talking about more like the social inclusion from an accessibility standpoint. I would say, I think that the disability side was not discussed. That's nothing that I read about or Marisa that we've talked about. But you did talk about having conversations around access and democratization of these tools, right?
Yeah, and that's how I'm translating this question, Wendy, whether I've got that right or wrong. And the thing is, for me, this was a huge issue that I felt was under-discussed. Because people were talking about at events where I was at events where I spoke about that were centered around the future of financial intelligence and how we're using fintech. And the issue of accessibility came in quite a bit. So when we're talking about democratization of AI, when we're talking about democratization of banking, when we're talking about democratization of anything having to do with technologies, who has access to that there's a number of issues there. Part of it can be education. Part of it can be geopolitical, and an enormous part, which is one that I focus on quite a bit, is, and I think, Rita, what you were alluding to is, the global South, the majority of Africa, many other countries in the world, even if they had the iPhone or the computer or whatever that the device is, if there is no infrastructure, they can't access it. And so speaking of the desire to democratize, and I'm not talking about political democratization, I'm talking about the desire to democratize, to give access, equitable access, is a huge one. And this has to do with bias, with gender equality, with geopolitical issues. It's very, very complex. So I understand sometimes the hesitation. But this is an enormous issue, and this is again one of the wicked problems, is that we can send up satellites, and that's actually happening, right? We're beginning to send up satellites to bring in the accessibility, and yet some of those satellites may have a cost to the environment that we also want to consider. And so again, because I'm an optimist, access is what I meant. Yes. There are more accessible solutions, and that can be on many levels, right? That can be accessibility for all kinds of things, including translation tools. That's actually to me, one of the great, amazing things that we get out of AI and out of learning language models, is that we're getting better access and better at translation. And so that does give more people more access, and so it's accessibility on multiple levels.
And I think this is actually a really interesting role for the private sector, particularly. You look at the way the private sector has created digital accessibility in India, particularly in thinking about mobile use and the cost. It's dollars a month, compared to, I was just having a conversation with someone who's visiting from Colombia, where when he talks about the price point of a smartphone, a line on a smartphone, he's talking about price points that are similar to the US, $40, $50 a month. So, compared to $3 a month. So there's the physical digital infrastructure, there's the financial infrastructure, that all go into making that accessibility true. Great. This is great. Please, everyone that's on the call, tell us where you're dialing in from, and ask us more questions. I think this is a great conversation that we're having so far. And if you are dialing in, I wanted to also mention, before we dive into our next conversation, that if you are dialing in, we have a special offer for you, a complimentary abstract. I think Arpita referenced this report earlier. We've recently wrote a report about from efficiency to responsibility, how enterprises are leveraging technology to drive up sustainability markets. And this report, if you sign up here, is the abstract is complimentary, and I think it'll give you a little more insight into what it is that we're doing here at Everest Group to forward this really amazing conversation. So I think, thank you, Nilushi, for asking about what the updates are. I think one of the things that's also important is what didn't get covered, right? What were sort of the important topics that we think should have been addressed given the audience and given, the stature of that audience, but did not. Marisa, do you have some thoughts on what you think should have been talked about more?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I mean, it was the issue of AI ethics was really in the background. And it was not forefront enough. And it is interesting because when it was mentioned, and I mentioned it, and each time I did, but not just me, there were a few others that when it was mentioned, the buzz that happened immediately following, because people were hungry for it. People were really wanting to hear more about it. Now, first of all, it's also important for the private sector to understand, because this is always important, as well as the public sector. There's a huge ROI on AI ethics. There's a gigantic ROI. If we are looking at something preventatively, right? And I use this analogy when I speak of AI ethics. I used it there as well. One of the few professions that has an agreement around the world globally is medicine. That's why we have Doctors Without Borders so easily. And the main tenet is do no harm. And so if we begin to go into, and it's with AI, this is really important. It's not just about the final product or after it's done. And that was a lot of talking about that was, we're gonna look at the case studies and then we'll change things. Instead of, it should be pre-design, design, development, investment, production, mobilization. We should be looking at ethical issues throughout the entire process. And that applies to healthcare, that applies to finance, because who can be harmed or who has access or who it doesn't have access is who does this serve? Those are the kinds of questions we ask. And AI ethics isn't only focused on what goes wrong, it's actually focused on what can we do better? How can we serve, right? That's really the question. How can we serve the best of what, and getting people to agree on what the best is? I mean, I always say, who's ethics, right? So when we're discussing AI ethics, but there are some basics. There are some basics that people can agree on. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I like the Hippocratic Oath as a frame of reference. I know there were some young MBA students that started this MBA oath many years ago. I don't know that it's gotten any wheels, but they used the Hippocratic Oath as their base to come up with, and their one-liner for the longer document was create value responsibly. And that being the purpose of business, saying that it's to create value. It's not the purpose of business is to make bucks. So, I love that frame. And I think it's really kind of sad that didn't get, wasn't front and center on the agenda, especially after we've learned so much about how technologies and spaces in this industry evolve and need to have that forethought to, yes, there's ROI, but avoiding risk as well.
Yeah. And the other thing that was interesting is because, the bias that can be gender, racial, ethnic, political, there's so many things that it can be built in. The other thing that was actually in Davos that I saw more of this year, not in the individual panels, but in presence in groups, were larger convergences of women's groups. World Women Davos, 100 Women of Davos, right? The AI House at Davos had, really had a lot more events of women in AI, things like that. There were more convergences, right? And convenings and of course, the FQ Lounge always has, but there was more consciousness of that in those clumps, not necessarily throughout, right? Because there are many, many panels and many rooms you walk into and it's all men. But the thing is, this is, again, one of those things with AI ethics. We're looking at, is this in service? Is what we're developing, is the technology we're developing in service of everyone, men and women, right? This should be in service of boys and girls, men and women, people, non-gender specific people. It should be in service of all peoples. The other presence that was there, which was a slight bit more than has ever been there before, but not enough yet, is indigenous populations. There was some indigenous presence there that was also quite interesting to note. The other thing that was also, I will say, the thing that to me, and I think it probably has to do with me personally, is the psychosocial aspects of all of this. The psychosocial aspects of, we're talking about products, we're talking about systems, we're talking about operations, but we're also talking about human beings. And to me, there's a lot of times not enough discussion about the underpinnings. What are the underlying reasons? What are the underlying drivers? What are the things that are driving change and not just from a marketing perspective, because there's plenty of talk about that, but from a perspective of how will we collaborate? Why would we collaborate? What stops us from collaborating? And what are the concerns that we're seeing around the world? And there are many that we are seeing socially, trends around the world that we are seeing that have to do with uncertainty, that have to do with job loss. Job loss was something that was discussed, but not really a lot of the realities of what that really means, that the majority of jobs will change. And so those are the kinds of things, or the hesitation or limitations of education that's available at the moment. So to me, those are the kinds of things that I would be grateful to see more discussed, because it is really about how we can be more human with each other. I actually think technology can help us be more human with each other by pointing out the ways if it can take away the other things, if it can take away other tasks, perhaps it can help us be more human with each other. But I think that how we are being with each other is a discussion. More of that discussion needs to be had.
I love that. It also sounds like we should basically create one of our own Davoses, where we talk about these issues that we see as more important for us. Yeah, that's great. And I do think that as these technologies get more and more embedded, these questions about how it really is human really come up, and it makes me think of my love of Star Trek, and how the android wanted to be human. So I think at the end of the day, we can't lose our humanity in any of these things. Yeah.
Well, there's an old Star Trek episode where they go to a planet where that's very violent, and I think it's Uhura and Kirk both say, "Oh, we don't do that anymore. We used to do that, but we don't do that anymore." Right? I'm looking at a question from Nailusha here that is also about power conversations, and honestly, they're had somewhat, but not enough. Not enough about who owns the data, who is controlling the data, right? That this is vitally important, and this has to do with data sovereignty. This has to do with data slavery and data sovereignty, as Arpita was referring to earlier. I think it's vitally important for anyone who's listening to this, for any companies who are working, because we're all working with technology in one way or another. How are we working with that data? How are we protecting? There are human rights involved. I actually just spoke at a big conference on this. There are human rights that are involved in this. There are that are ongoing, that can actually have extraordinary impacts on human beings' well-being, on people's well-being. And so when we're using things like digital twins, we really need to be, and also thinking about who's translating the data. And then how is the data possibly biased? Because the data, it could be biased data sets that we're not aware of. And then how is that data being handled in a way that we really are protecting each of the each of the components within it, as well as an organization and a company itself protecting their own integrity, because I think protecting a company's integrity is vital, and protecting the safety, because there was a huge amount of discussion we had people there were several panels of experts on cybersecurity talking about what you were speaking about before, Rita, of misinformation, the hacking of data and the hacking of systems in order to skew political gains, and a discussion. And there were not enough discussions also about an imbalance of wealth that is happening alongside this, that this is beginning to exacerbate. I think those were some discussions that we could do better. I think we can definitely do better.
Yeah, I think Nilushi's question also is interesting because we do see regulators at least thinking about data that's a little more tangible for regulators to figure out, and we see in Europe that there's certainly a lot more movement towards pushing businesses to be very transparent and open about how they're using the data, and to opt into the use of that data, as opposed to having to click through 10 million screens to get to the point where you can opt out. But I think when we start thinking about the more nuanced complexities as this technology evolves, in thinking about AI regulation, I've been in a lot of rooms where businesses have said, well, that's not my role as a business, that's the regulator's role. And the challenge is that the capability of governments to even regulate this and to know how it is that they regulate it, let alone paying the kind of salaries they need to pay to attract that talent that has those capabilities. I think it's really a challenge to talk about. And Arpita, we were going to talk about this a little later, but I think this is a good opportunity. You and your team and our team have shared really some fabulous work and insights on the talent, how sustainability talent is evolving in tech, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, sure. Definitely, Rita. And before talking about talent, I just want to quickly talk about data and the issues that we are facing with data. But there are still some positive elements around it that I want to highlight before we move to talent. So beyond CSRD, there is also due diligence directive now in Europe, which will, make the organizations talk more about what's happening within their organization, how they're impacting each and every stakeholder. And I think that's another important area where technology is playing an important role. And I think within Davos, there was this Nature Tech Alliance that was announced, which is a partnership between Nature Matrix, which is a platform supporting nature monitoring and impact reporting, with Salesforce, ERM, and a satellite imaging specialist, Planet Labs. And the Alliance's mission is to collect data that can drive conservation and restoration, and probably contribute to regeneration, to your point, Marisa, of nature ecosystems at scale, as well as, collaborate to provide full spectrum biodiversity management and disclosures for global corporations. So ultimately, it brings me down to that starting point, Marisa, that you mentioned around collaboration. So at the foundation of all of it, no single organization or stakeholder can do it alone. It's the private sector, government, regulation. Everybody needs to come together and involve the local communities as well, to take a more holistic approach towards these new technologies, regulate these new technologies, and regulate our businesses. And now coming to talent, education, as Marisa was also mentioning, will play a very central role. You can provide all kinds of data democratization, AI democratization to people within your organization, but if they do not understand the data, if they are not capable of capturing the value out of their data, you're limiting their ability to contribute in a meaningful manner. And that's where, at least what we are seeing organizations, some of the leading organizations do, is focus on building that domain understanding, be it with respect to technology, be it respect to the industry that they are working on, and the kind of impact their work is having on the organization or the community as a whole. So the education element, there is not, considering AI is such a fast paced technology, there's not enough supply of AI specialists out there. So the approach that is needed is more of upskilling. You need to empower your employees with the right learning and development initiatives. You can do it in collaboration with educational institutes. There are AI ethics courses being launched in some of the leading universities. Sustainability, ESG specific courses being launched in a lot of universities. And I think that's the right way to go. But there's a lot of demand, but the current supply is not able to match that demand, considering the pace of advancement, be it in AI or machine learning or any other technology that you can talk about. Supply currently remains very limited.
Well, and one of the things I would love to point out is in this, I'm actually working on a global alliance right now, working on a global education for multi-generational education for digital and AI education. But one of the things I think that, and all of those points I completely agree with, the piece that to me keeps being missed in the education is our leaders. Leaders need to be, the thing is, people who are this goes back to the psychosocial things. People who are very high up and very powerful very often don't want to admit that they don't know. And what we hear is, talk to my IT people. My IT people are doing this. The thing is, the IT people can't keep up with what's happening. As to your point, the advancements are happening so quickly that they can't keep up. So it really has to do with a re-envisioning of what education means, not just in universities. I mean, I've been working with IEEE on getting universities to put in AI ethics now for almost a decade. I think more will happen, but we also need a real education, because if I don't have to be an IT expert in order to lead responsibly, in order to understand some of the basic questions, in order to understand the basic differences, because what happens otherwise is people can't align because they're not understand that there's not a shared semantics. And that this is really essential. It's a relearning. It's some of it has to do with really letting go of things that they know so that they can relearn new things that they never anticipated having to learn. But the reality is that this has to happen at every single level of an organization, not just the people who are doing the kind of internal tasks. I just want to point that out, that there really is a need for leadership education when it comes to leading in this new frontier.
Yeah, and I want to actually tout our horn a little bit on that front, Marisa, because what I think one of the most important things about this sphere of sustainability, be it about climate or about social issues, is that everyone has ideas, and there's it doesn't matter where you are in a business. And so one of the things that we've done at Everest Group is we've created an internal sustainability fellowship. So we have folks joining from every practice area, spending a quarter of their time. So it's a huge dedication to continuing to research this space and to grow it and to elaborate on what it is that the tech and tech services industry needs to know about what's happening on sustainability. And I love the term social entrepreneurship. Some of the best ideas are going to come from inside, and I think with that vision or with that attitude of collaboration, be it internal or external, I think amazing things can happen. And that's how we're going to solve these wicked problems, as you referred to. Marisa and Arpita, final thoughts would be great. I think, Arpita, I really did want to hear from you on topics that you were hoping to hear from those folks out in the mountains, that you didn't hear about, and what it would have been more interesting for you to learn about.
I think Marisa covered it pretty well, so I will not get into the details of everything. But yeah, I expected climate to be more prominent, we can only hope probably next year it will be better. But I do like the aspect that it is no longer about making the case for sustainability, or making the case for governance. I think everybody is already aware of the implications. The focus for companies and financial institutions and governments are now on the how.
Yes.
How do we assess the issues potentially material to us? How do we take action to minimize and mitigate the impact and make our organization and the communities overall more resilient? How do we participate in the potential of new markets that are emerging because of these advancements in technology and the opportunities that sustainability entails? And I'll be more interested in hearing about this hopefully next year.
So maybe more of those examples, the cases of good things that are happening, as opposed to this sort of soapbox conversations, so that that too, Davos also becomes a forum for learning and for sharing, and amplifying the good things that are happening. I think that's a really fantastic point.
Yeah.
Marisa, how about you? Any final thoughts on your Davos experience? Was it worth the carbon footprint?
Well, that's always a debate, right? I think to Arpita's point, one of the things that was exciting there was as always, is the MIT Imagination Lab, because you're seeing, to your point, Rita, about what are things that are being done, and that connects to, I think, one of the final points I want to bring in, which is I really feel that there's such a need to have young people present and to be investing in younger people, who are going to, this is their world. They're about to go into this is stewarding their world, right? We've done not such a great job stewarding into this era, not because we meant to sometimes, but because, for all kinds of reasons. But it depends on the person. On the reality, though, at this point, I think that the investment in young people, there were some more young people there than it had been, which was very exciting to me. But I think that this would be something I would like to see more of. And I'd like to see, not just in Davos, not just when you have to take a plane, but in every organization, how are we bringing in young voices? How are we bringing in young minds? How are we investing in young people who have a whole life ahead of them, that can begin thinking about future generations? And so if I leave with some, I think it's attached to education, but it's beyond that. It's also honoring that young people do have a wisdom, very much a wisdom, because sometimes they're also seeing things not from a jaded perspective, or we've already done this, right? But sometimes from a new perspective. And I think that's not just about investing in young startups, but I think that's important, and entrepreneurship. I also think that investing in our young in every single way is one of the things I'd like to see and invite, and I welcome seeing throughout the new year.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was fantastic. Folks that are dialing in, one of the things that I love about this medium of LinkedIn Live is that it's easy to connect. So please do connect with any of the three of us, or all of us, but also the folks that were on the LinkedIn Live. It's very easy to network with them. And, I think the fact is that collaboration and getting everyone into this tent, making the tent bigger, is how we're going to solve these issues. So please do stay connected to our space and the work that we're doing around sustainability. If you haven't signed on to, if you are Everest Group sustainability page, LinkedIn page, please do follow that. We're really hoping to be part of this solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.